Today, we're going to be speaking with Tobias Rose-Stockwell, who's a designer, technologist, writer, and also author of the book Outrage Machine: How Tech Amplifies Discontent, Disrupts Democracy, and What We Can Do About It. Tobias, great to have you on. Maybe to start with, I think that if you ask a lot of people what started the cycle you describe in the book, it's very easy to say, oh, smartphones and social media. And like that's basically the technological underpinning. And the technological is more important than the sociocultural underpinning to where we find ourselves today. Is it that simple, or is there more to how we got to where we are and the status quo that you now describe?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, David. It's awesome to be here. I think that's a great question. We can look at the way that technology has influenced and amplified many of the trends that have been in process for a long time in terms of polarization, in terms of efficiency and targeting and segmentation of audiences in our media environment, and in terms of the kind of specific outraged punditry that has come to define a lot of our political news.
When we think about if it bleeds, it leads, and some of these phrases that have been around for a while, you could make an argument, and some make the argument that, local news 30 years ago, which is 22 minutes after you take away the commercials, half of which is, sort of titillating or salacious local news, that it's not really different than the fact that negative or fear-inducing or anger-inducing stories do well now, that it's a difference of maybe scope and scale. They spread more quickly when instead of having to watch the news, you can just reshare it to Facebook, but that it's not qualitatively different. What do you think about that? Is there a qualitative difference to the outrage machine that you describe now?
Well, I think differences in degree ultimately make differences in kind, right? So if you have a news diet of say 22 minutes of kind of salacious and outrageous punditry that you're consuming every night, then you're not going to necessarily revamp your entire worldview around that. But if it's attached to a device in your pocket that is available to you any time of the day, and in fact is with you any time of the day, through push notifications, checking our phones when we're in line at the grocery store, checking our feeds at work, then that does actually dramatically change the types of perceptions that we have throughout the day. We are actually in these other rooms always, right? We're in these other digital spaces constantly when we have our phones on us. So that does actually, I think, fundamentally shift how we see the world when so much of our time is spent in these spaces.
There's this interesting thing I've experienced where even the expectations placed on me as a content creator have really shifted, especially over the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, just some recent examples. When there was the news of this hospital bombing in Gaza that took place, I didn't report on it the first day because the information seemed really sketchy. It really, the Hamas said it was bombed by Israel, but was there evidence? And then there's videos that contradict it. So I waited, and part of my audience appreciated that. And I was able to go to them and say, hey, here's the video. Here's what we now have. We now have a better understanding of what really happened. Others assumed wrongly that I was avoiding the story because of personal reasons or in some way predicting that I was going to say something that would enrage my audience. It's almost like there's been a conditioning now that if you take yourself out of what is in some sense expected, you're the one who's behaving in the wrong way. That expectation setting seems to be very much directed by the infrastructure that you describe in the book. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, there is a demand for opinions and a demand for taking a side on every major issue that I think is very unique to this moment, right? In any conflict, in any fast-moving story, there's this inherent tension, right, for journalists and for people that are covering it, which is that if you want to be first, right, you want to cover it quickly, you want to have the scoop,
Mm.
but the newest information is often wrong, right? The fastest spreading rumors and declarations are often not the most accurate. So there's this kind of inherent tension that's present in all of news gathering for it's been the case since the beginning of journalism back in the day. But more recently, right, since we're hooked up to this constant feed since everyone has an opinion instantly. And this is largely a result of the way that Twitter is designed right now, which is that the fastest spreading information, the most kind of salacious emotional stuff will tend to get the most attention, likes, reshares, comments, and followers, right, for the people that are actually posting it. That process in itself actually has prioritized the gossip and the rumor and the hearsay above the verified information, above the verified facts. And yeah, this demand for opinions from everyone, right? This pick-a-sidedness on every single issue on an instantaneous basis is, I think, really toxic to our sense making, our ability to make sense of the world as really as a nation, as communities, and I think even as a species overall. We're really struggling right now.
What are some of the elements of the architecture that encourage and sort of generate the system that we have? I mean, I think we know a lot about on Facebook, for example, you're more likely to be shown stuff that already sort of confirms your worldview, and also things that will make you scared or angry because you're more likely to share it. And so there's like this algorithmic component. But what are some of the different pieces of this?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to three very specific features that were launched to social media companies between 2009 and 2012, each of these features on their surface actually looked quite good. They were made and launched with I think good intentions, but between the three of them, they've actually kind of upgraded our information sharing speed and the type of information we share. So the first is the algorithmic feed, which we're all familiar with, right? Which is how content is rank ordered by engagement, which tends to make outrageous stuff stick to the top of our feeds much of the time with a default engagement algorithm. The second is social metrics. So the likes, the shares, the comments, the numbers that are attached to each and every post and to each and every profile that basically make it a game as we share, right? It's like a game of getting the most points for every single point of information that we share online. And the third is the one-click share, the ability to press a single button and spread a piece of information to your entire audience. And it turns out the stuff that travels the fastest tends to be very low quality information. And if you don't have counters and weights in the way that information spreads and limits the way that information spreads, rumors, gossip, hearsay, like terrible information actually ends up spreading the fastest. And there's a precedent for this in history, which is that there were violent mobs that used to, a rumor would spread in a community back in the day, and violent mobs would form spontaneously and do horrible things, right? So the sacking of government buildings would happen pretty regularly, and in ancient times, pogroms against ethnic minorities would happen pretty regularly. And we basically built a system of doing that digitally now that operates much faster than historically it did, and the outcome is pretty tragic for a lot of us.
In terms of the why would social media platforms do this, is it quite simply that more engagement, more shares means more time on the platform for people, users, and then that generates more revenue for the social media companies?
I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I think that's, the fundamental business model is a big piece of the problem, I think, when it comes to just ad-based engagement revenue. I think there is a fundamental problem there, but it does come down to kind of a set of of conditions in which the platform defaults, right? The platform was built. In the way the platform was built, that were many of them were on accident. I think a lot of these people are actually good people. If you look at the Facebook files, there's a lot of people internally that are struggling with these issues, that are trying to figure them out, that are trying to study them and understand what's actually wrong and trying to fix them on a case-by-case basis. The problem is it's just a huge task, and a lot of these companies don't have the executive leadership to tackle these problems. And not enough pressure, like external pressure, for them to actually fix them, which is kind of a crazy thing to say, but there hasn't been any meaningful government regulation to actually help encourage these companies to fix these harms. And they're sitting on a lot of the data and evidence of the harms that we can't see, right? So that's actually part of it, is that they're sitting on a huge trove evidence of harms that are actually just not visible to us as society. So until there is more transparency, we're going to continue to see feet dragging, internally at these companies before these problems are fixed. And I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, and not to excuse the fact that some of these things haven't been fixed, but also I have a number of friends who are former employees at a lot of these platforms, and they said, even if 7 different teams have identified an issue and agree on it, the communication among these 7 different teams and the empowerment of anybody to actually coordinate making some of the changes that we all agree need to be made on a purely logistical level didn't happen because there was just no infrastructure to coordinate some of these changes. Even if everybody knew what the problem was, had an idea for the role of each of the 7 teams in fixing it, there were these sort of like, I guess we would call them practical employee-related, employment structure-related elements that prevented resolution because these platforms have gotten so big.
Yeah, definitely. And, the internal politics and difficulty in communication aside, communication across these companies is also pretty bad too, right? So if one company finds a set of harms and a very specific mechanism that causes those harms, oftentimes they're not going to share that with other companies that are dealing with the same problem. So there is really there's a big coordination problem collectively that these companies are facing both internally and externally to tackle these issues in a meaningful way, which is why I do think we need to have some effective government regulation that comes in to help resolve it.
You emphasize in the book the importance of individual user behavior and sort of like, without changing the system through regulation or whatever, that we as users can also take certain actions. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think there's been interesting work done on this. Cal Newport speaks about this regularly on his podcast and also in his books about, as a starting point, you might want to disabuse yourself of the notion that it's even necessary to keep up breathlessly with the minute to minute of a lot of these sorts of stories, particularly when you're going to have zero influence on it at all. And one of the things you can do is actually say, hey, I'm going to in advance decide I'm going to keep up with certain people on Twitter for 20 minutes, 3 times a week. And that is going to get me what I need. I don't need to then fall out of it because of algorithms or whatever the case may be. It's sort of like a restructuring. It doesn't mean you cut out all social media or things that are kind of unrealistic long-term, but the individual decisions of people. What sorts of individual user behavior do you recommend?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot we can do as individuals, fortunately, right? There's a lot of actually good tools and mental models we can deploy to kind of make our relationship with these tools more healthy, and making sure our contributions to these online spaces are actually more healthy. One of the tools that I use on a regular basis is called OneSec, which is a simple app. It's a Chrome plugin, it's an iOS plugin, and an Android plugin that you put on your phone. And what it does is it forces you to take a deep breath in and out before you actually enter into one of these apps. And just that simple act of being forced to take a deep breath before you enter into this app, it reduces the automatic habitual clicking and kind of automatic typing to the news site, to the social media feed, and actually does a pretty good job at kind of snapping you out of that automatic processing and pushing you to some more reflective processing. You're like, why am I here? Why am I actually in this space? Another thing is just recognizing that diet, right? Like you wouldn't eat junk food every single day of your life if you're trying to be healthy, right? News and information is a very analogous input, right? We eat food to stay alive. We need information to keep our communities together and to stay informed about the world. But if you have too much of the wrong kind of information, it's going to actually toxify your worldview, right? So thinking about it in terms of information diet, I think, is really important, and making sure that your inputs are in moderation, and that you're not regretting the time that you spend on these sites, right? So much of the time we actually have this kind of cycle we get into where we'll drop into a feed. This happens when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're maybe emotionally distressed or depressed or sad or unhappy. That's when the algorithms really get us. That's when we'll find ourselves spending 4 or 5 hours just scrolling, just stuck in one of these feeds. And so in those moments when you snap out, when you're finally on the other end of that kind of cycle, that is the moment when you should act and when you should put in some real constraints, right? So delete the app from your phone. Like Cal says, find some very specific times and schedule those times for actually using these tools. There's literally no need for anyone on Earth. I mean, maybe a couple people on Earth, but
Right.
very few people on Earth to be plugged into these things 24/7. They're not healthy for us overall. And you can get a good chunk of information. You're actually going to get better information the longer you wait, from a point of a conflict, from the point of an explosion of outrage online. Like, you're going to get better information and more reflective information the longer you wait from that point of the news item. So yeah, it is really important to just put some space between you and these feeds, because they are so they are asymmetrically powerful in kind of in pulling us in, keeping us there, and they don't have our best interest in mind. And
Yeah.
so we can do a lot to fix them.
Yeah, to my own detriment. I have both included a chapter in my forthcoming book and regularly talk about this. If you imagine an informational pyramid like the Dietary Pyramid, the bottom should be, in my mind, critical thinking, philosophy, epistemology, media literacy. Then you would go to history and economics and understanding the basics of some of these big topics. At the top is the sort of stuff that I do, which I think is absolutely fine, but it's the sort of stuff I listen to at the gym when I'm just at the gym. And really, I'm putting time aside to focus on the lower parts of that pyramid. And it sounds like it's very similar to the sort of strategy that you're outlining here.
That's right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is a very, like, we actually have a lot of agency in how we control our media environment and our choices and what we consume. But it does require effort. It does require work. The same way that you want to go to the gym to get healthy.
Right.
You need to reorient your attitudes and your behaviors around the information you consume, and you can do it. It's very possible. Millions of people do it, and billions of people do it effectively. And I think the people that do it well are the ones that actually end up with the healthiest perspectives, outlooks, and media environments in their lives.
We've been speaking with Tobias Rose-Stockwell. The book is Outrage Machine: How Tech Amplifies Discontent, Disrupts Democracy, and What We Can Do About It. We're linking to the book. Tobias, I really appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you, David. This is awesome.